Unfortunately, many people begin to think about their sins too late, when in fact it is no longer necessary and does not matter. My wife, when she found herself in a difficult situation, decided to reveal her dirty secrets and how she deceived me throughout our marriage. I also had a surprise for her. Margaret Connors reclined in the hospital bed placed in her main bedroom. After a long string of visitors, only her immediate family remained by her side. She let out a deep sigh, shifting her body to alleviate the persistent pain. With her current medication, the pain was still bearable, but its effectiveness was dwindling. The stark reality was that she was in the final stages of her life. The doctors had discharged her with hospice care, predicting that within a week or two the pain would escalate, necessitating stronger medication that would cloud her mind and induce prolonged periods of sleep. If she needed to put her affairs in order, the time to act was now. Glancing at her husband of 28 years, she felt tears welling up as she contemplated the pain she was about to cause. Doubt crept in once more as she questioned the wisdom of her impending actions. Yet, in order to depart this world peacefully, she knew she had to resolve some lingering issues. Having bid farewell to friends and family who had visited, only her closest loved ones remained. Harold, her husband, remained by her side in the room, while she could hear Elizabeth, her younger sister, along with Becky and John, her niece and nephew, in the living room. Confession, it was said, could cleanse the soul. Maggie hoped fervently that it would. Though it would be agonizing, she realized she couldn't depart with so many secrets weighing on her conscience. She prayed for their forgiveness. "Sweetheart?" she uttered softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, babe," he responded, the concern etched on his face amplifying the difficulty of her task. Seeing her tears, he hastened to her side. "Is it the pain?" he inquired gently. She nodded, meeting his tender blue gaze. "Yes, but it's not just the cancer right now, Hal. It's my heart that's breaking." He regarded her with an unusual expression, prompting her to compose herself and continue. "Darling, there are some things I need to discuss with you. Things that may be difficult to hear. Honestly, I don't have the strength to go through this more than once, so it's best if I do it now. Could you please invite Lizzie to join us?" Harold's puzzled expression gradually shifted to one of deep concern. "Maggie," he murmured, his tone tinged with palpable apprehension. "What's going on?" "My love, I'm attempting to make things right. I can't depart from this world carrying the weight of secrets I've been harboring. Please, could you fetch Lizzie?" He nodded before heading to the living room where voices were now muffled. "Can I really reveal everything to them?" she pondered. "Can I bear to shatter the hearts of those I hold dear?" The words she needed to express would bring pain, yet there was no alternative to alleviate her guilt. She had contemplated composing farewell letters but deemed it as an act of cowardice. Instead, she resolved to confront the truth head-on. Though her transgressions felt like a distant memory, she understood their profound impact on numerous lives. It all started 25 years ago with a seemingly minor mistake that escalated into something much greater. During the early stages of their marriage, Harold frequently traveled for business. Starting as a junior engineer in a construction firm, he was often dispatched to oversee various remote building sites. With time and experience, his travel commitments diminished, limiting him to brief visits to major construction projects. Maggie's career path took a contrasting trajectory. Initially, she had minimal work-related travel. However, in the last 15 years preceding her cancer diagnosis, Maggie extensively traveled the globe. Serving as a senior trainer for a large corporation, she traversed continents to conduct training sessions for their technical support teams stationed worldwide. Maggie grinned as she reflected on the recognition and admiration she had garnered over the years. Excelling at her job had brought her both acclaim and generous compensation. She'd evolved into the accomplished, resilient, and self-reliant woman she had always aspired to become. However, a quarter-century earlier, She was far from these achievements. At 30, she grappled with occasional loneliness inherent in dual career marriages. It was during this period that she stumbled. Recalling her past actions, Maggie winced at her attempts to rationalize them. She blamed Harold's frequent travels, her own sense of isolation, and frustration stemming from her then floundering career. Yet she recognized these as mere excuses. Harold had been an excellent, if not exceptional, husband, save for his constant traveling. She harbored no doubt about her love for him over the past 30 years. Despite being 2 years her junior, he often teased her about having a penchant for younger men. Little did he know how accurate his jest was. They had tied the knot only 3 years prior when she first encountered Sam. From their initial meeting, there was a strong connection between them, despite him being 5 years younger. While Harold possessed good looks and fitness, Sam exuded rugged handsomeness and a muscular physique. They were immediately drawn to each other. She hadn't intended to embark on an affair. Aside from occasional loneliness, she was content in her marriage. However, the thought of Sam's kisses and embrace ignited a fervent desire within her. Another significant barrier stood between them. Sam was engaged to Lizzie, her own sister. "You foolish woman," Maggie scolded herself. "Wacker. Matraadses. What do I understand?" It was a question she had pondered countless times over the years. The answers she discovered were too painful to contemplate. Maggie had always been the assertive elder sibling, with Lizzie often looking up to her with almost idolatrous admiration during their upbringing. While Maggie exuded sociability and extroversion, Lizzie tended to be more reserved and introverted. Despite their differing personalities, both sisters were attractive and attracted significant male attention, albeit from different types of men. This is what made Sam's entrance into Lizzie's life so unexpected. Initially, Lizzie resisted her attraction to Sam for months, especially since Harold, her partner, was away on a lengthy construction project in Florida, visiting home only briefly every few weeks. It was during these intervals that Lizzie sought solace in Sam's company. Sam shared Lizzie's ambition for career advancement, possessing a confident and assertive demeanor that drew her in irresistibly. Looking back, Lizzie chastised herself for recognizing her growing feelings for Sam, while still being committed to Harold. Yet, the internal conflict she experienced then paled in comparison to the terror she felt upon discovering her pregnancy. In that moment, she was overwhelmed with panic. She and Harold had only engaged in intercourse a few times around the likely conception period, and she believed they had always used protection. She also recalled using condoms with Sam, though their frequency of intimacy was much higher than with her husband. Furthermore, there were instances where their encounters were so passionate that condoms had broken. She was certain the child wasn't Harold's, which prompted her to abruptly end her affair with Sam out of fear. Despite her guilt, Sam was the only person she felt she could confide in. During those times, termination of pregnancy clinics were still relatively new and often faced protests and scrutiny. She was afraid of being recognized if she went to one. Although it might have been an irrational fear, she wasn't thinking clearly then. Sam persuaded her to visit a discreet clinic to avoid any inquiries or traces of her termination of pregnancy. Regrettably, she agreed. While the termination of pregnancy was successful, the procedure left her with internal scarring, greatly reducing her chances of conceiving. It was a secret she knew couldn't remain hidden. As she recalled the day a year later when she received confirmation from their family doctor about her infertility, a tear trickled down her cheek. She had deceived Harold, telling him she had a termination of pregnancy as a teenager without realizing the damage it had caused. His devastation upon learning he would never be able to father children, naturally, was heart-wrenching, as it had always been his dream. Initially, they discussed the possibility of adoption, but shelved those talks due to their careers. When they revisited the topic, fate intervened, suggesting it was karma, the universe's attempt to restore balance. Maggie had resolved to move past their affair, with Sam's agreement. Over the next 2 years, they successfully maintained a platonic friendship, prioritizing their current relationships over past desires, though it was challenging. Their shared ambition for successful careers strengthened their bond as friends. Sam was rapidly advancing in his career, while Maggie, with his guidance and support, saw her own career flourishing. Neither could have foreseen what lay ahead. Sam and Lizzie married a few months after the affair. Maggie wasn't surprised, knowing that despite their affair, Sam genuinely loved Lizzie. They seemed well-suited. Sam's dominant nature complemented Lizzie's submissive tendencies. Just a year and a half after their wedding, Lizzie fell into a deep depression. Although she struggled with depression as a teenager, this episode was much more severe. She lost interest in everything and withdrew into herself. There were even concerns about her safety, which is why she was twice registered with a psychotherapist. Eventually, she was diagnosed with clinical depression. Her desire for intimacy plummeted, which was compounded by the medications prescribed to her. Upset by the lack of intimacy, Sam confided in Maggie, who foolishly tried to comfort him, and they began an affair again, while Harold was away. Over the next 21 months, their relationship developed into true love. Even after Lizzie came out of depression and resumed a more active life with Sam, their romance continued. Maggie's only excuse was her love for both men. Throughout the novel, she continued to support Harold, even doing her best to meet his needs. Her relationship with her sister was becoming more and more complicated. Once the dominant older sister, she was now struggling with guilt and shame, desperately trying to avoid the scrutiny. The situation worsened when Lizzie announced her pregnancy. Maggie reacted badly at first, feeling a mixture of jealousy and regret over her own situation, although she managed to explain her reaction with sadness about her own situation. The internal conflict was tearing her apart. Feeling guilty for betraying her husband and sister several times almost forced her to confess. However, fate intervened once again. Maggie had recently started traveling more frequently, even if it was just to smaller destinations. One week, she was in Philadelphia while Sam happened to be in Pittsburgh for a conference. It was easy for him to extend his trip by a day and meet her at her hotel. Maggie and Sam had always been extremely cautious, taking extra precautions to ensure their affair remained undetected. Even when meeting in other cities, they behaved as though they were being watched. To avoid being seen leaving her hotel room in Philadelphia, Sam had departed in the middle of the night. It wasn't until later that day that Maggie discovered Sam had been the victim of a hit-and-run when he returned to Pittsburgh. He was in critical condition at a local hospital. Maggie shook her head slowly and let out a gentle sigh. Everything changed from that moment on. Sam's world became a nightmare, threatening to engulf her as well. Initially, when Maggie first saw him, she was horrified. His body was covered in cuts, bruises, and fractures. While she knew these physical wounds would eventually heal, there were two injuries that wouldn't. Sadly, he had broken his back, leaving him partially paralyzed from the waist down. Additionally, he had sustained a severe blow to his head, resulting in a diagnosis of moderate traumatic brain injury. Although not immediately evident since it didn't affect his speech, it caused occasional memory lapses and difficulty regulating emotions. He spent the following 2 months in a rehabilitation facility. Upon his discharge, he was a changed man. The trauma of the accident and his newfound reliance on a wheelchair led to emotional turmoil, with Sam oscillating between bitterness, anger, and depression. The once confident, occasionally arrogant man Maggie had known was now a mere shadow of himself. In the ensuing months, Maggie's pregnant sister provided constant care, relegating Maggie's role to that of a concerned sister-in-law. She watched painfully as Sam became increasingly dependent on his wife, yet she also observed his love for Lizzie growing stronger as a result. After finally having a private conversation with Sam, Maggie and he mutually agreed to end their affair. They parted ways, promising never to disclose their infidelity to their spouses. However, Sam's career suffered a significant blow due to his physical and emotional issues. While his company didn't abandon him, his rapid rise had alienated him from most colleagues, leaving him with few allies. It soon became apparent that his upward trajectory within the company had halted, plunging Sam into deeper despair. He began relying heavily on Lizzie, seeking solace from his troubles. Maggie found it distressing to witness Sam's decline. The silver lining amidst this ordeal was Lizzie's transformation from a timid individual to a more assertive one. Nevertheless, as time passed and Becky was born, it became clear that Sam and Lizzie would require additional support. With their insurance payout, savings, and Sam's sizable inheritance, they managed to purchase the house across the street. Sam's parents had advanced his inheritance to ensure they could cover his expenses that weren't covered by insurance. Initially, Maggie and Harold visited daily. Maggie assisted Lizzie in caring for Becky and managing household tasks, while Harold tended to chores that Sam was no longer capable of handling. Over the following couple of years, she witnessed Sam's personality wane while her sister flourished. Lizzie effortlessly assumed the roles of a caring mother and devoted wife, keeping a vigilant eye on Becky and Sam. Maggie sometimes felt Lizzie's protectiveness stifled Sam, yet entrusting his care to someone else wasn't an option. With Harold's reduced travel, he could dedicate more time to support them. Meanwhile, Maggie's career was thriving, leading her to travel extensively. A silver lining was Harold's newfound role as Uncle Harry to the baby, a comforting thought for Maggie amidst her career pursuits. Maggie still harbored guilt over her diminishing presence in Sam's life during that final year. He no longer resembled the man she had fallen in love with, the one she had risked her marriage and strained her relationship with her sister for. He had become despondent and pitiful. Though uncertain of her reasons for avoiding him, Maggie suspected she had begun to realize the folly of believing they were soulmates. As she began to spend less time at Sam and Lizzie's house, she encouraged Harold to spend more time there when he wasn't traveling. It provided her with a sense of tranquility, knowing that he was there in her absence. Looking back, it was probably not a wise decision. She hadn't thought about how Sam would feel seeing the man he had betrayed for years taking care of tasks around his home. It likely contributed to the eventual outcome. Upon hearing the news of Sam's suicide, she felt more sorrow than surprise. Lizzie was understandably devastated, not only because she had lost her husband, but also because she had just discovered she was pregnant. Maggie was aware of Sam's difficulties due to his paralysis, but was surprised to learn that it had no effect on his ability to father a child. At one point, Lizzie speculated that if Sam had known about the baby, he might not have taken his own life. Maggie doubted this notion. It was clear that Sam struggled with not being the dominant figure in a competitive world. Following Sam's death, both Maggie and Harold ensured that Lizzie and Becky were taken care of. Despite the life insurance policy not covering suicide, Sam's inheritance allowed Lizzie to stay home and care for her children for several years. There was initial discussion about Lizzie and Becky moving in with Maggie and Harold, but Maggie wasn't keen on the idea. With Sam gone, she worried that Lizzie and Harold might grow too close. While she knew their bond was like that of siblings and they would never cross any boundaries, there was no need to tempt fate. By that time, Maggie had dedicated herself to strengthening her marriage and was starting to reap the rewards. Their intimate life was fulfilling, and she and Harold seemed to have settled into a comfortable marriage focused on their careers with no children. Maggie had hoped for similar happiness for her sister. Nearly a year after John's birth, Lizzie began dating again, albeit infrequently. Lizzie, who had become more confident with motherhood, was attractive, so it was expected that she would seek another partner at some point. Maggie was shocked by the man Lizzie chose. His name was Jim, and he lived in another state. Lizzie had met him through a dating service. What surprised Maggie was that he was still legally married, although separated from his wife for years. Furthermore, his marital status was unlikely to change soon due to his young children and the family's legal and financial circumstances. Maggie was astounded by how much her sister had changed in recent years. Lizzie, once timid and reserved, had become colder and more assertive. When Maggie questioned Lizzie about the future of her relationship with Jim, Lizzie explained that due to his situation, they had agreed to limit interaction with each other's families. Lizzie justified her decision by stating that Harold was already a great male role model for Becky and John. She expressed contentment in letting Harold continue in that role while Jim fulfilled her other needs. Reluctantly, Maggie agreed, partly out of guilt and partly because Harold adored his niece and nephew. Thus, the cycle they had been in for the past 18 years continued. Lizzie had her romantic interest on the side. Harold played daddy with her kids, and Maggie enjoyed her husband and a successful career. Often, when Lizzie went to spend a weekend with Jim, either Maggie or Harold would take care of the children. It tended to be Harold more frequently, as Lizzie's business trips became more frequent. However, her husband didn't mind, as it gave him more time with Lizzie's kids. Maggie couldn't help but smile to herself when she thought of Jim. She hadn't seen him much over the years, but she had to admit he was attractive despite being older than Lizzie. Over the past 18 years, they seemed to have maintained a good, if distant, relationship. A sudden, sharp pang of pain brought Maggie back to reality. She winced until it subsided. She and Harold had built a good life together. They had been happy, and she had tried her best to be a supportive wife after Sam's passing. She had loved Harold wholeheartedly and had never strayed, despite the many temptations during her travels. She was also confident in Harold's love for her. She hoped his love would enable him to forgive her somehow. However, she knew her sister's forgiveness would be more difficult to obtain. Maggie anticipated that Lizzie would initially resent her. She hoped that her actions over the past 2 decades would mitigate the pain of her betrayal. She also prayed that familial bonds would outweigh the hurt she had caused. She resolved to reveal everything to them simultaneously. Not only did she lack the strength to endure the ordeal twice, but she harbored a hope that they might find solace and forgiveness in each other. The notion of her husband and sister potentially becoming romantically involved was not new to her. She pondered whether they would ever dare to traverse the boundary from a sibling relationship to a romantic one after her passing. Maggie remained uncertain about her feelings regarding this possibility. She grappled with conflicting desires, ensuring Harold's well-being after her demise and grappling with jealousy at the thought of her husband being with another woman. Selfish to the end, huh? She chastised herself. This will be my ultimate penance, nudging them to transcend the familial barrier and explore a romantic connection. She knew her husband would be devastated by her departure, so finding comfort in her sister's embrace didn't seem far-fetched. Lizzie's relationship with Jim had noticeably cooled. It appeared that, as soon as their children were old enough to leave home, Jim had opted against pursuing a divorce. Lizzie hadn't mentioned Jim or visited him in over a year, a few months after Maggie's cancer diagnosis. Since then, Lizzie and the children had spent a significant amount of time with Maggie and Harold. Maggie was genuinely grateful, as they had been a tremendous source of support for both her and her husband. Harold cautiously stepped into the bedroom, pushing the door open. From behind him drifted the voices of Becky and John. "Bye, Aunt Maggie," they called out from the adjacent room. "We'll swing by later," Becky added. "See you, Harry," they chimed before closing the front door. Maggie suppressed a laugh. She knew Harold despised being called Harry and would correct anyone who made the mistake except for Becky and John. They had always affectionately called him that since they were children. Even Lizzie had adopted the habit, calling him Harry a couple of years later. Years ago, Maggie had asked her sister about it, and Lizzie had explained that she started it to avoid confusing her young children at the time, but also to tease Harold. Maggie had understood and laughed, but she had vowed never to call him that. To her, he would always be her Hal. Now, her husband stood at the foot of her bed, while her sister sat beside her, holding her hand. Maggie looked at them and smiled. Harold still looked handsome and was in decent shape, even at 53. Maggie herself had aged gracefully and remained very attractive, even at 51. "I wanted to speak with both of you before my situation deteriorates further. Soon I may struggle to communicate or maintain coherent thoughts," she explained. "So," she continued with a sad smile, "before that happens, I need to confess something to you both." "Maggie, please don't," Harold interjected quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. She looked at him, feeling her heart ache. She had long sensed his suspicions about her and Sam, though they only surfaced after Sam's death. She believed Harold had never confronted her because he loved her deeply and didn't see Sam as a threat. She had wondered if Sam had ever hinted at their affair, but dismissed the thought since Harold would have likely approached Lizzie, who would have confronted her. Over the years, Maggie had worked to assure Harold of her fidelity through her actions, even though they never openly discussed it. She was confident he knew she loved only him. Now, however, she could see Harold's frustration mounting. He clearly wished to avoid this conversation, as was typical of him due to his aversion to confrontation. When he did confront, it was usually in a cold, businesslike manner. "I apologize, darling," she spoke softly. "I need to reveal the truth, and time is slipping away." "Please," Harold's tone was firm. "Let bygones be bygones." "Hal, I have to do this," she responded, attempting to avoid sounding patronizing. "I can't depart this world with these secrets lingering among us three." "Damn it, Maggie," he snapped. "I'm pleading with you, let it be." His sudden burst of emotion caught her off guard momentarily, yet her urgency to relieve herself of guilt outweighed his protest. "I'm sorry, Hal. I can't comply." Glancing at her younger sister, her heart constricted. Lizzie's expression revealed both dread and anticipation. Naturally, Maggie thought to herself. She's not naive either. Naturally, she had her suspicions. Summoning her determination, she pressed on. It was time. "They say the truth sets one free." Maggie prayed they were right. "I'm deeply, deeply sorry," Maggie's voice cracked with emotion. "But I must seek forgiveness from both of you. Years ago, I betrayed you both." "Over 20 years ago? I had an affair. With Sam." Maggie had thought she was emotionally prepared, but the anguished expressions on her sister and husband's faces shattered her resolve. Lizzie couldn't meet her gaze, and Harold's unwavering stare only intensified her pain. She couldn't decide which was worse. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to approach this," Maggie whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "But I hope you can somehow find it in your hearts to forgive me." Her husband's gaze made her doubt whether confessing had been the right decision. Lizzie had let go of her hand, hiding her face in her palms. A heavy silence enveloped them until Harold's composed voice broke it. "Why now?" "I'm sorry, Hal," Maggie replied softly. "I wish my motives were better, but they're not. I was lonely and foolish. I thought I loved him. I knew it was wrong, but I believed he was my soulmate." "That's not what I'm asking," her husband retorted coldly. "Why put us through this pain now?" "I'm sorry, but I had to. I needed to seek your forgiveness before it was too late." "What about us?" Harold's voice trembled with emotion. "What about Lizzie and me?" Maggie could only stare helplessly at them. Lizzie turned to her sister. "All I want to know is why," Lizzie said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How could you do that to me?" Maggie sighed deeply, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry, Lizzie. I can't justify my awful behavior as a sister. All I can say is that when we first connected, it was before you were married." "Lies," Lizzie spat. "We were engaged, so he was already mine. Why did you feel the need to steal him from me? And besides, weren't you married yourself?" "Yes," Maggie murmured, glancing guiltily at her husband. "I know you may not believe me, but I genuinely thought Sam and I were meant to be together. I understood that our actions would hurt others, but I believed it was fate." "I'm deeply sorry." She turned to her husband, seeing the mix of anger and pain in his expression. "I apologize, Hal, but it's true. I loved both you and Sam. I've always loved you, Hal, but at the time, I thought Sam was my soulmate. Later on, I realized that Sam and I were more like kindred spirits. If I had realized that sooner, we could have remained as close friends instead of becoming lovers. Instead, I ended up betraying both you and Lizzie. Though it may not seem like it now, I've always loved you, Hal." Lizzie snorted in disgust, and Harold sighed heavily. "I believe you," he said solemnly, surprising Maggie. I believe that you loved both of us, but I don't believe your love for Sam was love at first sight. It might have ended that way, but it didn't start like that. A love like you're describing takes time to develop. It requires numerous heartfelt conversations and many intimate moments to bond two hearts together like that. And that takes deliberate effort. It takes planning. The fact that you chose to invest time in building a relationship with another man is something I struggle to forgive. It's certainly something I can't forget. Maggie wiped away her tears and looked pleadingly at her husband. Slowly, she nodded. I sensed your suspicions long ago, not long after Sam's passing. But Hal, he never posed a threat to you. After his death, he didn't even cross my mind. Since then, I've been a devoted wife. Despite ample opportunities while traveling, I remained faithful. I never strayed. If you say so, Maggie, he replied softly. But after withholding your affair for 20 years, it's hard for me to trust you now. Even if you've stayed faithful since then, it doesn't erase your past with Sam. Forgiving was tough. Forgetting impossible. What? What are you saying? I knew about your affair long before Sam's accident, even before his death. Please, Hal, Maggie begged. Tell me you weren't involved in Sam's accident. Well, I can honestly say my involvement's significance is open to interpretation. Depending on who's asking, my role might be seen as indirectly contributing to his misfortune. Hal, why would you do this? Well, Maggie, the same could be asked of both of you. What did Lizzie or I ever do to deserve your betrayal? Maggie remained silent as tears streamed down her face. Slowly, her brow furrowed as the question formed in her mind. But how? How did you find out? I told him, Lizzie interjected in a cold tone. Maggie gasped. You knew? Yes, Lizzie confirmed, wiping her eyes. But when? How? Lizzie glanced at Harold, seemingly seeking permission. She must have received it, as Harold winced and nodded. Well, Lizzie continued, we had made a decision not to reveal everything, hoping you would pass away peacefully with your secrets. However, you've chosen to open Pandora's box, so I suppose everything will be exposed now. I apologize. To begin with, I discovered that you were having an affair with my husband just 1.5 years into my marriage. No, Maggie gasped, horrified. Oh God, no. Why do you think I fell into such a deep depression? Lizzie asked calmly. That's what happens when you discover that two of the people you trust the most in life are betraying you. Finding out that my husband had been with my older sister while we were engaged nearly crushed me. Maggie buried her face in her hands and cried. I never knew. Of course you didn't. You were so selfish. It was always about you, even when we were growing up. Lizzie glared at her sister, waiting to see if there would be a response. When there wasn't, she continued. I came very close to giving up back then. I was alone, afraid to confront Harry about it. I was scared because if he already knew, I would have completely lost it. Having all 3 of the people I loved the most betray me would have been too much. I tried to hold on to the fact that this happened before we were married. It was feeble, but it was something. I eventually pulled myself out of my depression and began trying to repair my marriage. Like a fool, I didn't confront the 2 of you at the time. Instead, I spent the next 6 months fighting to save my marriage. Imagine my shock when I discovered that my sister was once again sharing my husband's bed. That's when I started leaving a small recorder in our bedroom, as well as in yours and Harry's bedroom whenever he traveled. It didn't take long before I had evidence of your affair. I was torn between despair and anger when I realized I had been in competition with my sister for my husband's affections for the past 16 months. When I felt myself slipping back into depression, I took a chance and confronted Harry. I'm ashamed to say I was relieved when I found out he was as clueless as I had been. I had found an ally, and it gave me the strength to hold on. Harry was a lifesaver. With his friendship and support, I managed not to fall apart again. Maggie's despondent expression gradually shifted to a mix of shock and realization. She gazed at her husband, attempting to hold back a sob. "But that would mean you were aware even before," she murmured. "You never mentioned anything." "No," Harold responded brusquely. "I contemplated it, but Lizzie pointed out how vulnerable I was, financially and otherwise. It took some time to sort things out, but eventually I secured those aspects. I consulted with a coworker who had recently experienced a messy divorce, and he helped me establish an offshore account to discreetly move any untraceable funds. Once I was prepared to confront both of you, Lizzie intervened." "Intervened?" Maggie questioned weakly, confusion evident on her face as she turned to her younger sister. "Why?" "It's simple," Lizzie explained. "Confronting you then would have led to 2 divorces. Afterward, you and Sam would likely have ended up together, leaving Harry and me as the only ones truly losing out. So I proposed an alternative." Lizzie glanced at Harold, who shook his head slowly, a faint grin attempting to hide. Maggie stared at her husband in shock and horror. "Apologies, darling," Harold said, his face beginning to flush. "But it was quite the suggestion." "If it offers any solace, sister," Lizzie interjected. "Harry wrestled with my idea, particularly at first. Yet upon hearing some recordings of your meetings with my husband, he relented. Your constant declarations of love for him kept a glimmer of hope alive within him. However, hearing you profess affection for my husband, along with other revelations, was the final straw. I'm certain that was what ultimately convinced him to accept my proposal for a retaliatory affair." Maggie lay there, her mouth opening and closing like a stranded fish, her mind racing as she began piecing things together. Lizzie continued, adopting a business-like tone as if presenting a report at a meeting. "What Harry and I had back then was more of a friends with benefits arrangement. I don't know how long it would have lasted, but then I faced the same problem you did. I discovered I was pregnant and didn't know if the child was my husband's or my lover's." Maggie gasped. You knew?" she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks once more. "Yes, you mentioned it a few times during our conversations," Lizzie explained. "I was still cautious about Sam's reaction, so when I brought it up to him, I hinted that there might be a possibility of pregnancy. He reacted oddly, so a couple of days later I reassured him it was a false alarm. I noticed how visibly relieved he was. He might have forgotten his reaction, but I didn't. I spoke to his mother later that week. Sam's parents were living in France at the time. Their family wasn't particularly close, but I asked her if Sam had ever shown an interest in children. She thought he did, but doubted he'd ever consider adoption. She also mentioned that Sam had told them we'd discussed this before we got married. The truth was, there wouldn't be any children because he was sterile." "Infertile?" Maggie exclaimed, horrified. "Yes, it appears he had complications from a childhood illness." "But," Maggie stuttered, her complexion turning pale. "That would mean—" "Yes," Harold interjected icily. "That would mean you terminated our child to conceal your affair, and your lover knew it wasn't his." "No," Maggie cried out. "Oh God, please no." She huddled into herself, clutching her fragile legs. It felt as though her heart was breaking, and she struggled to breathe. "No!" Her heart protested, though she knew it was true. How could Sam betray me like that? Oh God, what must Hal think of me? He must have despised me. Maggie fought to steady her breath. Tears streamed down her face as she gazed silently at her husband, consumed by shame. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "I had no idea." "That was the other thing," Harold pressed on, disregarding her apology, "which eventually led me into Lizzie's arms." Both Hal and Lizzie observed silently as Maggie wept. A myriad of emotions played out on their faces, encompassing pity, compassion, guilt, remorse, as well as anger and pain. Hal broke the uneasy silence by speaking up. "Then we faced a dilemma. Lizzie was actually pregnant with Becky, a fact Sam would soon discover. How he would react remained uncertain, but it was bound to be explosive once everything came to light. That's when I took action and made some calls. Eventually, Sam confronted Lizzie and she retaliated by exposing his affair and infertility. She fabricated the identity of the real father and framed it as a one-time act of revenge. She also warned him that if he disclosed anything, she would ruin his chances of a relationship with you and threatened to involve me, suggesting I might seek revenge. That bought us a little time, though it didn't halt his affair with you. Then you both traveled to Pennsylvania. After Sam's accident, your affair came to an end. Maggie's eyes widened. You attempted to have Sam murdered? She choked out. No, I actually requested that your affair be terminated without causing you physical harm. The specifics weren't crucial. I was surprised when it happened, and even more so by the outcomes. How could you? Maggie stuttered. If you're wondering how I could take action like that against that jerk, seriously, are you kidding me? Let's see. He posed as my caring brother-in-law, was cheating on my sister-in-law, having an affair with my loving wife behind my back, and played a significant role in the loss of my unborn child. How could I not take action against him? Now, can you understand why I didn't care whether the scumbag lived or died? Maggie shut her eyes, beginning to grasp the consequences her affair had on her husband and sister. It was her and Sam's betrayal that had hurt her husband and her sister, altering who they were. Hal's calm voice snapped her out of her realization. When it comes to the logistics, Lizzie explained, it wasn't too difficult. I simply transferred some funds from my offshore account and allocated them to a few promises of undercharging for services on specific construction projects to cover the costs. Maggie, don't be so surprised. Anyone who has been in construction has dealt with individuals claiming to have connections. The truth is, some of them actually do. Lizzie continued softly. When Sam was discharged from the hospital, it was clear he wasn't the same. Physically broken and emotionally fragile, he lied to me, insisting your affair had ended before he went to Pittsburgh. He pleaded to work on our marriage if I terminated my pregnancy. I told him since he was sterile, I intended to keep the child, but agreed never to reveal she wasn't his. I also warned him that if he ever disclosed this to you, I would do everything in my power to ruin what was left of his life. He loved you, sis, but I made it clear that once you discovered his involvement in your termination of pregnancy, reconciliation was out of the question. He asked why I kept it from you and Harry. I explained that if he spilled the beans, it would force me to confront both of you, risking the loss of both a sister and a brother-in-law. I wasn't willing to take that chance, as I still needed both of you. He reluctantly consented. Afterwards, Harry assisted me in securing our finances. We safeguarded most of Sam and my assets to prevent him from using them as leverage in a divorce. For months, we endured a harrowing ordeal, grappling with the question of whether our marriage was salvageable. While Sam clung to hope, I knew deep down that it wasn't. My focus was on navigating the next steps. Meanwhile, Sam struggled with the aftermath of his accident, his recovery slow and arduous. Watching my pregnancy progress only added to his frustration. Even after Becky was born, he found it difficult to bond with her. It became clear to both of us that our relationship was irreparable. My own struggle stemmed from the betrayal I felt, particularly since it involved my sister. Complicating matters further, I had developed strong feelings for your husband. Though our affair ended after the accident, I couldn't shake my emotions for him. We agreed to prioritize our marriages until after Becky's birth. Sam's situation deteriorated rapidly. His professional life suffered, and our marriage was crumbling. Despite his efforts to hold on, it was futile. When Becky was around 5 months old, Sam discovered the truth about the paternity. Perhaps it was the way Harry looked at Becky or the way I looked at him, but Sam pieced it together. His reaction was a grave mistake. He confronted us both, threatening to expose the truth to you. In a fit of rage, he taunted Harry, revealing his involvement in your termination of pregnancy. Harry, pushed beyond his limit, snapped, That night, Sam nearly drowned in our bathtub. We concocted a story to conceal the truth. But in reality, Harry had tipped him out of his wheelchair and into the water. Maggie gazed in shock at the transformation of her usually gentle husband into a person capable of violence. Harold appeared visibly uneasy as he glanced guiltily at his unfaithful wife. "I'm not proud of what I did," he murmured softly, his embarrassment evident. "There was a rage inside me that I always kept hidden from you, but Sam triggered it that night. Thank goodness Lizzie intervened. She pleaded with me not to go through with it as I held him underwater. In the end, she brought me out of this state, otherwise I could have done something terrible. When I came to my senses, I pulled him out of the tub." He was coughing, choking, and crying. I warned him that if he uttered a word, I'd finish him off and make it look like another accident. I could see in his eyes that he understood, and I was certain he knew I meant it. After that, things took a strange turn. "Why?" Maggie asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "What do you mean by strange?" "Well," Harold began. "Well, after that Well, what Harold is trying to say," Lizzie interjected calmly, "is that we resumed our affair of revenge, only this time I made sure Sam knew about it." "Lizzie, you didn't," Maggie exclaimed. "I certainly did. You both know he deserved it. But Harry still loved you and was protecting you, so all my anger and pain was directed at my unfaithful husband. He begged and pleaded with me to stop, but I reminded him that he had cheated on me for years, and I intended to continue for a while longer. I told him that at the end of that period we would decide if either of us wanted to attempt to salvage whatever remained of our marriage. I genuinely believed that hope was the only thing keeping him going in those final months. Unfortunately, when I informed him that I was pregnant again and that Harry was the father, he realized it was over between us. Yes, he was aware of John. About a week after I broke the news to him, he waited until I took Becky with me to the store and took his own life. If he hadn't, I'm uncertain how our lives would have unfolded differently." "For Lizzie's part," Harold interjected, "we ensured she and the children were taken care of. We unfroze her family finances, including Sam's inheritance, which was originally meant for his long-term care. Additionally, I redirected the funds I was accumulating into my offshore account. Together, it provided more than enough for Lizzie to stay home with the children for many years." "How did I divert the money?" "Well, it was surprisingly simple. With both of our incomes, we were never in financial trouble, so there was never any reason for you to scrutinize too closely. I didn't touch your individual investments, but funneled most of mine, along with any bonuses and salary increases, into my offshore account. You were so focused on your career that you never questioned why my bonuses and raises were so modest. When Becky and John reached school age, I arranged for Lizzie to be hired as a consultant by one of the companies I had connections with. It offered flexible hours utilizing her degree, and since her income was supplemented by my offshore account, it was equivalent to a full-time salary. Between that and their inheritance, they were financially secure for life. "Now it's my turn," Lizzie interrupted. She cleared her throat and cast a sweet smile at Harold. He stifled a chuckle and nodded in agreement. "Having my finances sorted," Lizzie began in a quiet tone, "it allowed me to concentrate on the chaos that consumed my personal life. Things got really tangled up during my pregnancy with John. Alongside my feelings for Harry, his feelings towards me started shifting. It wasn't just about getting back at someone anymore. Harry began to care for me beyond friendship." Maggie glanced nervously between her sister and husband. Her question hung in the air, unspoken yet palpable. "You see, darling," Harold spoke gently, "I truly empathize with your admission of loving both Sam and me. I found myself in a similar predicament. Although I wouldn't have let myself fall for Lizzie if I hadn't discovered your infidelity first. Nevertheless, I found myself in a dilemma. I was growing fond of Lizzie, yet my love for you remained. Despite the pain of your affair, I wasn't prepared to give up on us and discard you." Maggie gasped at the blunt honesty of his words. The notion of Harold potentially divorcing her over her affair hadn't crossed her mind seriously before. She had always brushed aside such thoughts. Harold's voice brought her focus back to the conversation. "Hearing you declare your love for me, even amidst your affair, gave me a twisted hope that our marriage was salvageable. Yet I couldn't bear to leave Lizzie, or the children, either." It wasn't an ideal solution, perhaps even cowardly, but I chose to do nothing. I continued to love you both. I can't quite explain it, but I've always been grateful that Lizzie seemed to understand my feelings. Initially, I thought she might find someone else after John's birth, someone who could love her exclusively. "Oh, I tried," Lizzie chuckled sadly. "I tried, but my heart kept pulling me back to Harry. So after a year, I told Harry I'd take whatever part of him he could offer. That's when we came up with Jim." "Jim?" Maggie murmured. "Was Jim not real?" "Oh, Jim was real," Harold replied with a smile. "He was a client of mine from Washington. He owed me a favor and was willing to play the role of Lizzie's boyfriend when he visited my company in town. He and his husband found it amusing, him pretending to be in a relationship with her." "But your visits?" Maggie whispered, visibly drained both physically and emotionally. "On those occasions when Harry was away and you were looking after the kids, I would join Harry wherever he was and we'd spend some quality time together. But more often than not, Harry would come over and we'd spend it as family time." "The children," Maggie faltered. "Did they know?" "No, not initially," Lizzie replied softly. "They knew Harry was taking on a fatherly role. They even started calling him Daddy. We quickly put a stop to that by having them call him Harry instead. So whenever they called him Harry, it was like calling him Daddy." Maggie felt her stomach churn and a wave of nausea hit her. She briefly contemplated the irony unfolding before her. She wanted to scream, but felt too weak, so she watched in horror as the wreckage of her marriage continued to unfold. "As they grew older," Lizzie continued, "they began to suspect that our family was different. I told them Harry was their father, and you and I were like their mothers. That explanation worked for many years until they reached their teens. Although they had already suspected it, we told them the whole truth after their 18th birthday. Surprisingly, they didn't have as many issues as we feared, since Harry had always been their daddy anyway." "How long did your affair last?" Maggie asked weakly, as she composed herself. Lizzie looked at her bewildered while Harold let out a deep sigh. "Maggie," he spoke softly, "it's not over. My affection for Lizzie remains as strong, if not stronger, than it was years ago. Frankly, we intend to marry once you're gone. Even the kids are considering changing their last names legally. I apologize, Maggie. We had hoped to keep this from you, to ensure your passing would be peaceful. Now, that seems unlikely." "Maggie," Lizzie interjected, "I still cared for you despite the betrayal. My own actions were equally wrong. You asked if I could forgive you, and the answer is yes, but I couldn't forget. That led me to justify my own regrettable actions at the time, things I'm ashamed of. Starting my relationship with Harry was a mistake, but my love for him now is genuine. I love you, Maggie. Despite everything, my love for you remains. And I love Harry too. Ultimately, I cared for both of you enough to share him with you." "Just as you said earlier, Maggie," Harold added gently. "I love you both. I hope you've had a fulfilling life, filled with love and success. I've tried to support your career aspirations and make you feel cherished throughout the years. You asked for our forgiveness earlier, and I can honestly say we have forgiven you, but your affair profoundly altered our marriage. Now the question is, can you forgive us?" Maggie sat in shock. The familiar foundations of her world were collapsing. Beliefs she once held unshakable were proven false. Her heart raced, breaths labored, struggling to comprehend the revelations. Then, Harold's gentle voice broke through her turmoil. "Maggie?" She lifted her gaze to her husband and sister. Harold stood behind Lizzie, embracing her as she wiped away lingering tears. "Maggie," he spoke again, "I regret you didn't heed our warnings and chose to bring all of this to light. We had hoped to avoid this. Nonetheless, we've had 20 years to forgive you. You have only a few weeks. We'll give you space in the living room to reflect." Lizzie rose, joining Harold's departure. Maggie couldn't ignore their intertwined hands. Lizzie paused, looking back at her bedridden sister. "Reach out if you need to talk," Lizzie said with sorrow, "or if you reach any decisions." Maggie curled into herself, weeping. It felt as though her soul had been ripped from her body. This wasn't how she envisioned things unfolding. The truth, ugly and raw, lay exposed. Now the dying woman faced a cruel dilemma. Could she forgive those she just asked forgiveness from? Even more agonizing was the realization that in a week or two, none of it would matter.